What is this book about? About starting this?
So, so we were living in Australia, and when the Americans invaded, and the Taliban.
Why did the Americans invade? Sorry, I'm going to ask questions and interrupt. It's way too much.
Well,
But Russia's gone.
9/11. Well, Russia. So Russia. So Soviet Union invades Afghanistan with 120,000 troops. They stay for 10 years, almost 10 years.
Can't take it.
Can't take it. Huge, obviously, reputational damage. They lost a lot of troops. And then Gorbachev decides it's too expensive. It's too costly for us in terms of...
Yeah.
So Afghanistan's there, right? So the Soviet Union invades.
Were they always big there? Were they already... Did they
yeah,
have
they're all the way up there, yeah.
Okay.
All of Central Asia. So Gorbachev decides it's too much for us, reputational, dollar-wise. So they decide to leave in 1989.
Okay.
A civil war. So the groups which were supported by the Americans, for the Americans it was convenient to have the Islamists fight the Soviets.
To keep them occupied.
To keep them occupied. They fought well. They were committed to it. They were driven by ideology. So the Americans and the Saudis and others pumped billions of dollars into the country, and they helped these Islamists. And that, in a lot of ways, radicalized the entire region, because people indoctrinated in this sort of extreme fundamentalist views of Islam were attracted to this holy war. And then, of course, when the Soviets left, the Americans said, well done. We're out of here, basically. And they completely disengaged. Then these groups, which had fought the Russians, started fighting each other.
For 12 years?
Well, for 3 years.
Okay.
Right? From 1989 till 90... Well, they initially fought the Afghan communist regime, which basically...
And these are all groups fighting separately against the Russians?
So the Russians leave, but the government, which was supported by the Russians, a communist regime, managed to hold on for another 3 years.
Okay.
Right? Eventually, that government also fell. Then these Islamists, these different Islamic groups, religious groups that had fought the Russians and the Soviets, they took power in 1992. And then for the next 3 years, they fought each other. Completely destroyed the city of Kabul, 50,000 dead, hundreds of thousands injured, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people had to flee the city. And then in 1995, this group called the Taliban, religious students, march right through Afghanistan, take over the country, pretty much almost unopposed.
Like Pol Pot, almost?
Well, I mean, there was... In
terms of the march?
In terms of the march, well, I'm not that familiar with Pol Pot and Cambodia, but they came pretty much unopposed, because I think there was fatigue in terms of fighting. And also they represented something new, because they said, listen, enough of the fighting, enough of the cruelty that we've witnessed over the last few years.
This is the Taliban?
This is the Taliban. So they took over the city, and with the exception of the northeast of the country, pretty much the rest of the country fell to the Taliban.
Okay.
But they also attracted a lot of these other non-Afghan individuals and groups, including Osama bin Laden.
What was he?
Well, he was living in Afghanistan, but I think that he became sort of a lot more active during the Taliban reign in the mid-90s.
Okay.
Forces loyal to him or his supporters attacked embassies in Africa. A U.S. naval ship was attacked.
Why? Because the radicalism extended beyond the Afghan borders?
Well, I think bin Laden basically was on the same side as the Americans, because he went into Afghanistan to fight the Soviets.
Okay.
With the support, of course, of the Americans. Maybe not directly, but they were all on the same side. I think bin Laden's issue with the Americans was the invasion of Iraq in 1991.
Okay.
Right? So bin Laden felt, as a Saudi, that the Americans should not be on Saudi soil, because the Americans had to base themselves from, and the large operation was conducted from Saudi Arabia, if you recall, to liberate Kuwait in 1991.
Right. I remember that one. I remember the attack overnight and was like, what?
Yes, over there. So, and then...
Iraq, Kuwait, there we go. Okay.
Yeah. So then bin Laden turns against the Americans. And in the mid-90s, if you recall, embassies were attacked in Africa.
That was bin Laden?
That was bin Laden's group, Al-Qaeda. And I think a naval ship was attacked in Yemen and so forth. So the Americans, he became sort of enemy number one. And then 9/11 happened, and it was traced back to bin Laden. And then the Americans gave the Taliban an ultimatum to give him up. And the Taliban refused to do so. They said, well, he's our guest, and well, as long as he's here, we don't condone his actions, but at the same time, we're not going to give him up.
So Taliban is like the greater government?
The Taliban is the government.
Is the government, and then Al-Qaeda is just some group?
They're, like, quote-unquote guests.
Right.
They have fighters, they do training.
So this would be like if, let's say I had a cyber attack on Cambodia, and then Cambodia's like, we want to arrest him. America's like, no, we're not sending him to Cambodia. That's a U.S. citizen.
Well, you're a citizen,
right?
But bin Laden was not an Afghan citizen.
Okay,
right? But they refused to give him up. And then the Americans, I think the Americans were itching for a fight anyway, so they invade Afghanistan.
And when you look at Vietnam, they were like, the French left, and the Americans like, give us a few years, we're going in. If you're gone, there's always these power struggles, and like once one group comes out, like who's gonna get it?
Yes.
You know, when East Timor, when the Portuguese pulled out, Indonesia waited like 10 minutes, and they're like, it's ours.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's because I think people don't think through these operations. The assumption is it's going to be over within a year or 2 years.
But you look at the Russians couldn't take it forever.
And the Brits. Prior to that.
It's every time I see a pizza place open in a place where a closed pizza place was, and I'm like, are you out of your mind?
Yeah.
The model doesn't work in this building. Well, how are you going to do it differently?
Yes.
Open a bookstore.
It was Einstein who said that, definition of stupid is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result.
Yeah.
So the Taliban were toppled by this huge military, let's call it exercise. The international community sort of supported this operation.
You're there for this?
No, I wasn't there in 2001. I went for the first time in 2002.
Okay.
I had not been back since 1978.
Wow.
So we went back. The Taliban basically dispersed. They went to the countryside, or they went to neighboring countries, in particular Pakistan. And then the Americans initially were reluctant to go beyond Kabul. They thought, well, this is a success. And then these things creep up on you, right? So then they deploy troops outside the country. We have to destroy Al-Qaeda. They're chasing bin Laden. And all of a sudden...
Pakistan.
And then all of a sudden, they're, very, very involved in security and subsidizing the Afghan economy, trying to rebuild this nation. Nation building is a tough exercise, especially in the 21st century.
Yeah.
So then 20 years on, having lost thousands of troops, $1 trillion.
So many dead soldiers.
And I think both...
So many dead civilians, too.
A lot of Afghans died in that period. Cities were destroyed. Towns were destroyed. People's lives destroyed. By both sides. I mean, it wasn't just the Americans, but the other side also was quite brutal. And then the Americans decided to leave, which is understandable after 20 years. It's America's longest war.
Oh.
So Trump wanted that, and Biden also wanted that, and the Americans are gone. And the Taliban take over.
Okay, we saw it here as this massive, like, what the fuck? I know people that were in the military, they're like, what? I got to talk to all my brothers and say, like, we fought for nothing and don't feel bad. But, like, yeah, what? And it seems like such a waste. I mean, immediately the Taliban took over. But we viewed them as not this, like, government group. We viewed them as this evil. They're almost synonymous with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The Taliban was used interchangeably here.
Yeah, well...
To someone like me, to a non-expert.
I mean, I don't know who it was who said that, it's just the way a terrorist is sometimes a freedom fighter and vice versa, right? So we just have to wait for the history books.
Yeah. Yeah, the word insurgent's so interesting.
Yeah.
Insurgent, like, what do you mean? Like, he killed an American troop. Like, why are we even at his house?
Yeah.
It's just like, just don't be there.
I mean, listen, we were cheerleaders for the international intervention because we felt, well, this evil government needs to be toppled. But looking back now and reflecting on what we saw over the 20-year period, we see things differently. I see things differently.
Where you been and where you going? This is Ari's travel show, yeah. We're gonna go on a journey today and see what there's to see in this big world. We're exploring different places, seeing all different types of faces. We're gonna talk about travel today. It's UB Trip.